The wind came down from the Kansas plains like a blade that winter. It carried snow across the frozen fields and through the empty roads, pushing white drifts against fences and wagon wheels. Most folks in the countryside had already locked their doors for the storm, but not everyone had a door to close. Near the edge of an abandoned supply trail outside Abilene, a small wooden wagon sat half buried in snow. Its wheels were frozen stiff in the ice. Beside it stood a boy no older than 6. His coat was far too thin for the weather. The sleeves were torn, and the wool had hardened from days of cold wind and melting snow. Still, the boy did not move away. Inside a rough wooden crate set on the ground beside him, a baby cried weakly beneath a bundle of blankets. The boy shifted his weight, gripping a thin stick in his mittenless hand. His name was Eli Turner, and he had made himself a promise. He wouldn't let anything happen to his sister. The baby's crying grew louder. Eli crouched beside the crate, brushing snow off the blankets. "It's all right, Clara," he whispered, his voice shaking from the cold. "I'm here." The baby's tiny face was red from the wind. She kicked weakly beneath the blankets, her cries rising into the frozen air. Eli glanced around the empty road. Nothing. No wagons. No riders. No houses in sight. Just endless fields buried under winter. 3 days earlier, things had been different. 3 days earlier, they had still been a family. Their father had been driving the wagon south, hoping to reach Abilene before the storm. Eli remembered the sound of the horses' hooves crunching across frozen dirt. He remembered his mother holding Clara in the back of the wagon, and he remembered the moment everything changed. The horses had spooked in the snowstorm. One sharp crack of wood, the wagon tipping sideways, the scream of metal and frozen ground. When Eli woke, the wagon had already rolled halfway down a ditch. His father lay still in the snow beside the broken wheel. His mother was breathing then, but barely. She had pulled Eli close, her face pale beneath the falling snow. "You take care of your sister," she had whispered. Eli nodded. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he promised anyway. By morning she was gone too. The storm had buried the road and no one had passed since. Eli didn't know where to go, but he knew one thing. Clara needed him. So he dragged the crate from the wagon, wrapped her in every blanket he could find, and stood guard beside her. That had been 2 days ago. Now the cold had crept into his bones. His fingers barely moved. His stomach had stopped hurting from hunger and settled into a dull emptiness. But every time Clara cried, Eli forced himself to stay awake. He picked up the stick again and stood beside the crate like a soldier. The wind howled louder. Snowflakes blew sideways across the empty road. Eli squinted into the storm. For a moment he thought he saw something moving far down the trail, a dark shape in the swirling snow. At first he thought it might be another wagon, but then the shape grew larger. The sound reached him next, slow, heavy, hoofbeats, a horse. Eli's grip tightened around the stick. The rider slowly emerged through the snowstorm. A tall man wearing a wide hat and a heavy brown coat. The horse snorted as it stepped through the drifting snow. The rider noticed the broken wagon first, then he noticed the boy. The horse stopped. For several long seconds the man simply stared. The wind blew snow between them. Then his eyes moved downward, to the wooden crate, and the crying baby inside. The man swung down from the saddle slowly. His boots crunched into the snow. Eli stepped in front of the crate immediately. The stick rose in his shaking hands. "Don't come closer," the boy shouted. The man froze. Snow gathered on the brim of his hat as he studied the small figure standing guard in the storm. Behind the boy, the baby cried louder. The rancher lowered his hands slowly. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said gently. But Eli didn't move. The stick trembled in his grip. "Go away," he shouted again. The rancher looked at the baby, then back at the boy. The wind howled across the empty trail, and for the first time in many years, Samuel Carter felt something stir in his chest he thought had long turned to stone. Concern. He took one careful step forward. The boy raised the stick higher. Snow whipped between them, and the rancher realized something that made his heart sink. The boy wasn't just protecting the baby. He believed he was the only thing keeping her alive. Samuel Carter slowly removed his gloves and knelt down on the snow so he would not tower over the child. But the boy still didn't lower the stick. The baby's cries filled the frozen air, and Samuel Carter knew one wrong move might send the terrified boy running into the storm. So he spoke carefully. "Son," he said quietly, "where are your folks?" The boy's eyes hardened. "They're gone." The wind carried the words across the white field. Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked again at the crying baby, then back at the stubborn little guard standing in front of her. And slowly he realized something else. This child had been standing out here far longer than anyone should. Samuel Carter drew a slow breath, because the decision he made next would change all three of their lives forever. The wind did not ease. If anything, it grew colder. Snow drifted across the abandoned road, piling around the wagon wheels and the boys' boots. The world had turned white and quiet, except for the soft crying coming from the wooden crate. Samuel Carter stayed kneeling in the snow. He had dealt with spooked cattle, stubborn ranch hands, and more than one armed drunk in his years on the plains. But none of that prepared him for the sight of a 6-year-old boy trying to defend a baby with a stick. The boy's hands were shaking badly now, not from fear alone, from cold. Samuel noticed the boy's boots first. They were too large, likely his father's old pair, tied tight around his ankles with a strip of cloth. Snow had already worked its way inside. Behind him, the baby whimpered again. The sound made Samuel's chest tighten. He spoke slowly. "You two been out here long?" The boy didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the rancher, watching every movement like a cornered animal. Samuel glanced toward the broken wagon half buried in the ditch. One look told him everything he needed to know. The wheel was shattered, the axle bent. One of the horses still lay in the snow nearby, stiff with frost. This had happened days ago. Too long. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked back at the boy. "What's your name, son?" The stick lifted a little higher. The boy's voice came out rough and tired. "Eli." Samuel nodded slowly. "Well, Eli, my name's Sam Carter." The boy didn't react. Names meant nothing to him right now. All that mattered was the crate behind him. Another gust of wind swept across the road, sending snow into Samuel's coat collar. He ignored it and studied the baby instead. Her face was pale now, too pale. The blankets wrapped around her were damp and stiff with ice. Samuel knew cattle that wouldn't survive a night like this without shelter. A baby certainly wouldn't. He looked back to Eli. "You mind if I take a look at your sister?" The answer came instantly. "No." The word snapped through the air like a gunshot. Samuel didn't flinch. He had expected that. Eli's grip on the stick tightened. "You stay back." Samuel raised his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "I ain't gonna hurt her." "You might take her." Samuel blinked. The boy's eyes were burning now with stubborn determination. "She's mine to take care of." Samuel sat quietly with that for a moment. 6 years old, and already carrying a promise heavier than most grown men could bear. Another cry rose from the crate. Eli turned quickly and crouched beside the baby again. "It's all right," he whispered, brushing snow from her blanket. "I'm here." Samuel watched the boy carefully. The way he checked the blankets, the way he kept his body between the crate and the rancher, the way he refused to show how badly he was shivering. That wasn't stubbornness alone. That was responsibility. And Samuel Carter recognized it, because once, many years ago, he had felt the same thing. A memory surfaced, uninvited. A small wooden crib. A tiny hand wrapped around his finger. A fever that wouldn't break. Samuel swallowed the memory down hard. That life was long gone. But the sight in front of him stirred something he thought had frozen away years ago. He spoke again. "Eli, you been eating?" The boy didn't answer. Samuel glanced toward the wagon again. Most supplies had likely been thrown during the crash. Then he spotted a torn flour sack near the wheel. Empty. That told him enough. Samuel reached slowly into his coat pocket. Eli instantly spun back around. The stick came up again. "What are you doing?" Samuel held still. Then he slowly pulled out a small cloth bundle. Just food. Eli didn't lower the stick. Samuel carefully opened the cloth. Inside was a thick piece of jerky and half a biscuit from that morning's ride. The smell carried faintly through the cold air. Eli's eyes flickered toward it. Just for a second. Samuel saw it. Hunger. But the boy didn't move. Instead, he shook his head. That's yours. Samuel felt something twist inside him. I got plenty more back at the ranch. A lie, but a necessary one. The boy still hesitated. Behind him, the baby cried again, weaker this time. Samuel lowered the food slowly onto the snow between them and pushed it forward. You can have it. Eli stared at it. Several long seconds passed. The wind blew harder. Finally, Eli crouched carefully, never taking his eyes off Samuel, and grabbed the biscuit first. He broke off a small piece and placed it gently into the baby's blanket beside her. Then he took a bite. Samuel watched him chew slowly. The boy didn't rush, didn't stuff the food down, just small bites, like he was making it last. That told Samuel even more. The boy had been rationing what little food he'd had. Samuel finally asked the question that mattered most. Where were you headed? Eli swallowed. Abilene. With your parents? A pause. Then Eli nodded once. Samuel looked toward the wagon again. Your folks, they pass in the crash? Eli didn't speak, but his silence was answer enough. Samuel removed his hat for a moment as the wind blew past. Then he placed it back on his head. The truth settled heavy in the cold air. 2 orphaned children, miles from town, in the middle of a winter storm. Samuel stood slowly. Eli's stick rose again immediately. Don't! Samuel stopped and held his hands out. I ain't leaving you here. We're fine. Samuel looked at the boy's shaking legs, the frost gathering on his eyelashes, the baby whose cries were growing weaker by the minute. No, Samuel said gently. You ain't. The wind howled louder, rattling the broken wagon. Samuel turned and walked slowly toward his horse. Eli watched him carefully. The rancher reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a thick wool blanket, then another, then a small canteen. He walked back carefully and stopped a few steps away. I'm going to wrap your sister in this, Samuel said, holding up the blanket. Eli shook his head fiercely. No, Samuel crouched again. Eli, if she stays in those wet blankets much longer, she ain't going to make it through the night. The boy's breathing quickened. He looked down at Clara. The baby was crying again now, but the sound was weaker than before. Eli's stick lowered just a little. Samuel saw the hesitation, saw the fear behind the boy's stubbornness. The child wasn't trying to be difficult. He was trying to keep his promise. Samuel spoke softly. You did a good job keeping her alive this long. Eli looked up sharply. No one had said that to him since the accident. You did real good, son, Samuel continued. But now you need help. The boy's lip trembled slightly. But he didn't cry. Instead, he asked one quiet question. If I let you help, you won't take her away? Samuel met the boy's eyes, and in that moment he understood the real battle taking place. This child wasn't afraid of dying in the snow. He was afraid of losing his sister. Samuel took a slow breath. Eli, I ain't here to take anything from you. The boy studied him carefully. Snow drifted between them. Then Samuel added one more sentence, a sentence he hadn't expected to say when he rode out that morning. I'm here to make sure both of you live. Eli looked down at Clara again, then back at Samuel. The stick lowered another inch. The moment hung in the frozen air, because the boy was about to decide something that would determine whether they survived the storm, or whether the rancher would be forced to do something far more desperate. For several long seconds, Eli Turner didn't move. The wind whistled through the broken wagon behind them, tugging at the boy's torn coat. Snow clung to his hair and lashes, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were locked on Samuel Carter. The stick in Eli's small hands trembled as if it weighed 100 pounds. Samuel stayed perfectly still. He knew better than to rush a frightened colt or a frightened child. Behind Eli, the baby let out another cry. It was thin now, weak and shaky. the kind of sound that made a man feel cold clear through his bones. Eli glanced back at the crate. The baby's tiny hands were wriggling out from the blankets, her face pale against the gray sky. Samuel could see it plainly. The child was running out of strength. The rancher spoke quietly. "Son, she needs warmth." Eli swallowed hard. "I know." His voice cracked. Samuel shifted slowly and lowered himself onto one knee in the snow, bringing himself closer to the boy's height. That moment, the one that would be remembered years later, happened right there on the frozen road. A hardened rancher kneeling in the snow before a 6-year-old boy guarding his baby sister with a stick. Samuel removed his hat and set it beside him. "I ain't gonna hurt her," he said again. The boy's breathing grew uneven. "You promise?" Samuel didn't answer right away. Promises on the frontier were not small things. They were heavier than iron. But he saw the boy's shaking shoulders, the frost creeping into the baby's blankets, and the empty road stretching for miles in both directions. So Samuel Carter said the words, "I promise." The wind roared across the plains. Eli looked down at Clara. His sister's cries were fading now into weak little gasps. The boy hesitated only a moment longer. Then slowly, the stick dropped from his hands into the snow. Samuel didn't waste a second. He moved carefully toward the crate. Eli stood close beside him, watching every motion like a hawk. Samuel lifted the frozen blanket edges and gently slid his thick wool blanket underneath the baby. The cold cloth crackled with frost as he peeled it away. Clara whimpered softly. Samuel worked quickly but gently, wrapping the baby snug in the dry wool. The transformation was almost immediate. Her tiny body stopped shivering quite so violently. Eli leaned closer. "Is she okay?" Samuel nodded. "She's tough, just needs warmth." The boy let out a breath he had probably been holding for days. Samuel then pulled out the small canteen from his coat and uncorked it. "Got a little warm broth in here," he said. "It'll help." Eli watched carefully as Samuel dipped a finger into the canteen and touched it gently to Clara's lips. The baby stirred, then slowly began to drink the drops. Color returned faintly to her cheeks. Samuel glanced at Eli. "You done real good keeping her alive." Eli didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked something small, something that revealed just how long he'd been carrying this burden alone. "Do babies stop crying when they die?" Samuel's chest tightened. "Sometimes," he said softly. Eli looked down at Clara again, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd feared. "I thought so." Samuel looked at the boy with new understanding. Eli hadn't just been protecting his sister. He'd been listening to every breath, watching every cry, waiting to see if she would stop, and he had refused to let that happen. Samuel rose slowly to his feet. The wind had begun to shift now, dark clouds rolling across the distant plains. Another storm front. If they stayed here much longer, none of them would make it back to the ranch. Samuel walked toward his horse and untied a thick bedroll from the saddle. When he turned back, Eli was still standing guard beside the crate. Samuel crouched again. "We need to get you two somewhere warm." Eli frowned. "Where?" "My ranch, about 6 miles east." The boy looked uncertain. "That's far." Samuel nodded. "Not if we ride." Eli glanced at the horse, then down at Clara. "Can she ride?" Samuel smiled faintly. "She'll ride just fine." He carefully lifted the bundled baby into his arms. Eli tensed immediately. Samuel noticed and paused. "She's safe," he said gently. Eli watched closely but didn't reach for the stick again. Samuel walked to the horse and secured the baby carefully against his chest inside the warm folds of the bedroll. Then he turned back to the boy. "All right," he said. "Your turn." Eli hesitated. "I can walk." Samuel shook his head. "You ain't walking 6 miles in this storm." The boy looked stubborn again, but his legs were shaking badly now. Samuel extended a hand. "Come on." After a moment, Eli stepped forward. Samuel lifted him easily onto the saddle behind the bedroll. The boy immediately leaned forward, pressing close to the baby. "Clara?" Samuel nodded. "She's right here." Satisfied, Eli wrapped his arms around the bundle protectively. Samuel swung himself into the saddle. For a moment he looked down the empty road toward the broken wagon. The snow had already begun to bury it. The past was disappearing behind them. He clicked his tongue softly, and the horse began moving. The wind pushed against them as they started across the frozen plains. Eli held tight to the baby the entire way. The ride was slow. Snow grew deeper as they crossed the open fields. The sky darkened. Another storm was coming fast. Samuel glanced back once. The boy's head was beginning to droop from exhaustion. But even half asleep, Eli's arms stayed wrapped tightly around his sister. Samuel muttered quietly to himself, "Tough little fella." An hour passed, then another. Finally, the dark shape of Samuel Carter's ranch house appeared through the blowing snow. Lantern light flickered in the windows. Eli lifted his head weakly. "Is that it?" Samuel nodded. "That's home." But as they rode closer, Samuel noticed something unusual. The ranch gate stood open, and the lantern hanging on the porch was swinging wildly in the wind. Samuel slowed the horse. Something wasn't right. Eli noticed it too. "What's wrong?" Samuel's eyes narrowed toward the house. Then he saw it. Fresh tracks in the snow leading toward the barn, too large to belong to cattle. Horse tracks. More than one. Samuel felt a cold tension spread through his chest. He tightened the reins, because whoever had come to his ranch in the middle of this storm was still there. Samuel Carter pulled the horse to a stop just short of the gate. The wind was rising again, carrying fresh sheets of snow across the yard. The lantern on the porch creaked as it swung from its hook, throwing wild shadows across the ranch house walls. Eli stirred behind him. "What's wrong?" the boy whispered. Samuel didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the ground. 3 sets of horse tracks. Fresh. Too fresh. They cut through the snow from the road and led straight toward the barn. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. Nobody was supposed to be here. He lived alone on this ranch. Folks from town only came out when they had business. And no one came riding through a storm like this unless they were desperate. Or trouble. Behind him, Eli shifted slightly. The boy's arms were still wrapped tight around the bedroll holding Clara. "She's warm now," Eli murmured quietly, almost to himself. Samuel glanced back. The baby had fallen asleep, her tiny face tucked deep in the wool blanket. That alone was reason enough to keep them safe. Samuel leaned back slightly and spoke low so only Eli could hear. "Son, I need you to stay real quiet for a minute." Eli nodded immediately. The horse snorted softly as Samuel guided it forward through the open gate. The ranch yard was silent except for the wind. The barn doors were half open, creaking as they rocked back and forth. Inside, something shifted. Samuel heard the faint clink of metal. Someone was definitely in there. He slowed the horse to a stop. Then he swung down carefully from the saddle. "Stay put," he told Eli. The boy nodded again. Samuel reached beneath the saddle and pulled free the revolver he kept in a leather holster. He checked the cylinder quickly. Loaded. Good. He walked slowly toward the barn doors, boots crunching softly in the snow. The wind gusted harder, rattling the loose boards. Samuel pushed the door open another inch. Inside the barn, lantern light flickered across the stalls, and 3 men stood near the hay bales. Riders. Strangers. Their horses were tied along the far wall, steam rising from their backs. One of the men noticed the door move and turned. "Well now," the man said with a crooked grin. "Looks like the owner finally showed up." Samuel stepped fully into the doorway. The cold wind rushed in behind him. "What are you doing on my property?" The tallest of the 3 men chuckled. "Storm drove us off the trail." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Gate was closed this morning." The man shrugged. "Guess the wind opened it." Samuel didn't move. He knew lies when he heard them. The 3 men looked rough. Travel-stained coats, unshaven faces. One had a rifle leaning against the stall beside him. Another wore a revolver low on his belt. The 3rd man stepped forward slightly. "You got a warm barn and dry hay," he said. "Thought we'd wait the storm out." Samuel studied them carefully. Then he said something simple. "You can wait it somewhere else." The smile disappeared from the tall man's face. "Now hold on," he said slowly. The other two shifted their weight. Samuel didn't miss the movement. The tension in the barn thickened. Then the tall man spoke again. "You live out here alone, don't you?" Samuel said nothing. The man's eyes drifted toward the open barn doors, toward the ranch yard, toward the horse outside, and the small shape sitting in the saddle. "Well now," he said quietly, "looks like you got company tonight." Samuel felt a surge of cold anger. "You leave them out of this." The man smiled again. "Oh, I reckon we won't." The second rider stepped closer. "Storm's coming harder," he said. "Road to Abilene's buried already." Samuel knew what they were implying. They wanted the ranch, the barn, the supplies, and they believed a single rancher couldn't stop them. Normally, Samuel Carter might have agreed, but tonight was different. Because out in the yard sat a small boy who had already fought too hard to keep his sister alive. Samuel stepped fully inside the barn. The door slammed shut behind him as the wind gusted. "Gentlemen," Samuel said quietly, "you're about to make a mistake." The tall man laughed. "You think that little pistol scares 3 men?" Samuel's voice stayed calm. "No," he paused, "but I reckon the storm outside should." The men exchanged glances. Samuel continued. "You start trouble here, and none of us are leaving this ranch before the snow buries the road." Silence hung in the barn. The wind roared against the wooden walls. Finally, the third rider spoke up. "We ain't looking for a fight." Samuel nodded once. "Then saddle up and ride." The tall man's hand slowly drifted toward his revolver. Samuel raised his pistol just slightly. "Don't." The moment stretched tight as a pulled rope. Then, a sound broke the tension. From outside the barn, a baby crying. The 3 men looked toward the door. Samuel's heart dropped. Clara had woken. Eli must have tried to calm her. The tall man grinned slowly. "Well now," he said, "sounds like you got more than cattle to take care of tonight." Samuel's jaw tightened, because he knew exactly what those men were thinking now. 3 riders, 1 rancher, and 2 helpless children outside in the storm. The tall man's hand dropped fully onto his revolver. "Reckon we'll be staying a while after all." Samuel Carter slowly raised his pistol, and for the first time since finding the children on the road, he realized the promise he made to Eli might have to be kept the hard way. The barn fell silent except for the wind hammering against the wooden walls. Clara's crying drifted through the cracks of the door again. Soft, fragile, but loud enough for every man in that barn to hear. Samuel Carter didn't take his eyes off the 3 riders. The tall one smiled slowly, his hand still resting on his revolver. "That baby's got good lungs," he said. Samuel's voice was low and steady. "You leave them alone." The man shrugged. "That depends on you." The storm outside roared harder, rattling the lantern hanging above the stalls. Samuel could feel the weight of the moment settling around them. 3 men, 1 gun, and a promise he had made in the snow. He thought of Eli standing out there in the wind with that stick, thought of the boy's tired eyes and frozen hands. The kid had stood alone against the whole world for 2 days. Samuel Carter wasn't about to let him face it again. The tall rider finally drew his revolver, slow, deliberate. The other 2 followed his lead. Samuel didn't move. "Put it down," the tall man said. Samuel's voice stayed calm. "No." The man smirked. "You ain't winning this." Samuel glanced briefly toward the barn doors. He could hear Eli's quiet voice outside now. "Shh, Clara. It's all right." The boy was trying to soothe her. Samuel spoke again. "You men ought to think real hard before you pull those triggers." "Why's that?" "Because storms like this bury men quick." The tall rider chuckled. "Reckon we'll risk it." The barn seemed to hold its breath. Then, a sudden crash of thunder rolled across the plains. The horses tied inside the barn spooked, stamping and snorting. For a split second, the riders glanced toward the noise. That was all Samuel Carter needed. His revolver cracked like lightning. The lantern above the riders shattered instantly, plunging the barn into darkness. The men shouted in surprise. A gun fired wildly. Another horse kicked against the stall wall. Samuel moved fast. He dove behind a stack of hay bales as another shot exploded through the barn. Wood splintered nearby. The storm howled louder outside. The tall rider cursed. "Get him!" Boots thudded across the barn floor. Samuel waited. One of the men rushed past the haystack, trying to see through the darkness. Samuel stepped out and slammed the butt of his pistol into the man's jaw. The rider collapsed instantly. Another shot rang out. Samuel dropped low as the bullet tore through the hay behind him. The second rider stumbled in the darkness, trying to aim. Samuel fired once. The man yelped and dropped his gun, clutching his arm. Only the tall rider remained. The man backed toward the barn door, breathing hard. "You're making a big mistake," he growled. Samuel stepped forward slowly. The revolver was steady in his hand. "No," Samuel said quietly. "You did when you came here." The tall rider looked toward the door again, toward the crying baby outside. Then he looked back at Samuel, and something in Samuel Carter's expression made the man reconsider. Because the rancher standing in front of him now wasn't just defending a barn, he was protecting a promise. The tall rider slowly raised his hands. "Fine," he muttered. Samuel nodded toward the door. "Take your horse and ride." The man didn't argue. Within minutes, the riders were gone, disappearing into the storm. Samuel waited until the hoofbeats faded into the wind. Then he lowered his pistol. The barn fell quiet again. Outside, Clara's crying had grown softer. Samuel holstered his gun and stepped back into the storm. The cold wind hit him like a wall. Eli sat on the horse exactly where Samuel had left him. The boy looked terrified, but he hadn't moved. His arms were still wrapped tightly around the baby. When he saw Samuel walking toward him, Eli's voice trembled. "Are they gone?" Samuel nodded. "They're gone." Eli looked down at Clara, then back at Samuel. "You kept your promise?" Samuel felt something warm stir in his chest again. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did." He lifted the boy down from the saddle. Eli's legs nearly buckled when his feet touched the ground. Samuel caught him quickly. "You're safe now." The boy didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward and hugged Samuel's coat. Just for a second. Then he pulled back, embarrassed. Samuel pretended not to notice. He carried Clara inside the ranch house while Eli followed closely behind. The warmth of the fireplace filled the room. Samuel laid the baby carefully in a rocking cradle near the fire. Clara sighed softly, finally drifting into a peaceful sleep. Eli stood nearby, watching. Samuel poured a bowl of hot stew and handed it to the boy. Eli ate slowly at first, then faster. Samuel sat across the table quietly. After a while, Eli looked up. "What happens now?" Samuel leaned back in his chair. The firelight flickered across the room. "Well," he said, "you two can stay here tonight." Eli nodded. "And tomorrow?" Samuel looked toward the cradle where Clara slept, then back at the boy. "You ever worked around cattle?" Eli frowned. "No," Samuel smiled faintly. "Guess we'll start teaching you." Eli stared at him. "You mean we can stay?" Samuel shrugged casually. "Ranch could use another hand someday." The boy's eyes widened. "And Clara?" Samuel nodded toward the cradle. "She'll have a roof over her head." For the first time since Samuel met him, Eli smiled. A small smile, but a real one. Cha. Years later, the Kansas winters came and went. Storms rolled across the plains just like they always had. But life on Samuel Carter's ranch changed. Eli Turner grew tall and strong. By the time he turned 16, he could rope cattle better than most grown men in Abilene. Clara grew up laughing in the ranch house, chasing chickens across the yard and learning to read beside the fireplace. And Samuel Carter, the lonely rancher who once rode those plains by himself, found something he thought he had lost forever: a family. Folks in town used to ask him about the day he found the children. Samuel always told the story the same way. He'd lean back in his chair and say, "Truth is, I didn't rescue that boy." Then he'd glance across the yard where Eli worked the cattle and Clara laughed near the barn. "That boy saved something in me that winter, and on cold nights when the wind blew across the plains." Samuel Carter sometimes remembered the sight that changed everything. A small boy standing in the snow, guarding his baby sister with a stick, refusing to give up until help finally arrived.